The presentation that I'm giving today is about a 2-year research project which we've just completed at the council. I don't want to build it up too much, but I think this is possibly the most important presentation that I'm going to give in the 15 years that I've been involved with the council. So I am going to build it up a lot, and I'll tell you why. And by the way, let me explain, there's some uncomfortable things in what I'm going to show you today, because the whole world, and I bet everybody in this room, and me intrinsically, believes that density is better than horizontal spread. Verticality is better than suburbia. We all believe that. However, several years ago, when we started to look for the research studies to prove this, we found that there weren't real involved research studies, and studies that had been done were very large data studies. Total energy of Chicago divided by total population of Chicago. And we felt that many of the nuances, important nuances, were being missed. So 2 years ago, we set out on a research project where we took 250 households in 4 real residential buildings in Chicago. We took the equivalent number of households in a suburban part of Chicago, and we tracked energy usage, actual energy usage for a year, transport movements, quality of life indicators. We approximated infrastructure provisions and what the implications of that, embodied energy in the home, and water use. And the findings were a little bit surprising, and as I say, a little bit uncomfortable. So before I start, I just want to highlight one thing. If you see that, this is a pilot study. So although the findings are surprising in some cases, we also realize that there's some significant limitations in the project, which I'm going to tell you about as well. And this is a pilot study. In other words, it's the starting point to what we think is a much bigger research study which needs to happen, and needs to happen on an international level. So the starting point for the project was, what is more sustainable? Density or suburbia? By the way, I bet we see this graph 20 times this week. I bet you've all seen this graph. This is a graph that plots urban density against gasoline use in transportation. But it's used many times to show that the Hong Kongs and the Singapores and the Tokyos of the world are far more sustainable than the Houstons and Phoenix and Detroits of the world because of the infrastructure provisions, predominantly transport infrastructure provisions of being, about car ownership. Well, all well and good, but this study was done in 1986. I bet there are people in this room that weren't even born in 1986, and it's not really been updated significantly since. So we set out to quantify and compare 6 things. Home operational energy use, embodied energy of the dwelling, water use, mobility and transport movements, urban-suburban infrastructure, quality of life, which is often the forgotten thing of sustainability. This is the framework which I'm not going to go through in detail. Well, I'm going to go through it in each step. By the way, this was a really involved study, and I'm just going to show you some of the major findings. Behind each finding that I'm going to show you are pages and pages and a lot of work, which is going to come out in the report that we're publishing early next year. The case studies. By the way, this shows the urban and suburban development of Chicago over the last 100 years, from 1900 to 2005. So Chicago is typical of many American cities. This massive suburban sprawl. Here are the case studies we chose. 4 towers downtown, and then anyone who knows Chicago, Oak Park. Now, the reason I put this slide up, let me just make clear here, we did not take a best case urban to a worst case suburban. The suburbs go for another 2 hours beyond Oak Park. We could have chose Aurora or somewhere like that, and the findings would have been very different. We chose Oak Park for a number of reasons. It's 7 miles from the center of Chicago. It's plugged into significant infrastructure. You can travel downtown by the elevated train, the metro train, by various forms of infrastructure. So we chose it because we felt it was more in an American context, the closest you get to a more European and Asian context where there is infrastructure provision, predominantly public transport infrastructure provision. So you can see here the location of Oak Park on the left and the 4 towers that we took downtown. The 4 towers include a couple of Mies van der Rohe buildings from 1956, but they also include 2 250-meter-plus towers built in the last 6-7 years. By the way, I'm not presenting today the findings between the 1956 and the 2010 towers, but I can tell you that that's also very interesting, and not what you'd expect in terms of the performance of these buildings. But today I'm just concentrating on the urban and suburban. This is typical of Oak Park. 75% of these are single-family homes, 72% built before 1950. So bear that in mind in terms of the findings. Very old. I can disclose that I live in Oak Park. My house and all my neighbors' houses were part of this survey. So our main data collection, we developed this big portal, this big website, and we asked the residents to engage in giving us energy bills. We got a fantastic engagement. It took a lot of pushing, but the essence of this project was really about the quality of the data. So to get the actual energy bills was hard work, but we got them. We got the support of the owners, the village of Oak Park, the management associations inside the building, and without that, we couldn't have done the project. Okay, let me point a few things out. Let's talk about demographics first, because that's important. 250 households. It's a significant number. Many of the characteristics from downtown and suburban were the same. 48% female in terms of the population, the occupants, 88% white. By the way, we'll come back to some of these things, which was a limitation on the project. Let me point out the things that were different, which became big limitations on the research project. 38% of all the people living in those 250 households in suburbia were kids. 38%. High-rise building, 6%. There's a commentary right away. 20% of the people in the high-rise buildings were retired, as opposed to 6% in suburbia. The average age of residents, adding up all the kids and everybody, was 20 years higher in the high-rise scenario than the low-rise. Average household income in the high-rise buildings was $232,000. In the low-rise, $182,000. You've got to see those against the Chicago average of $60,000, average household income. The reason I'm telling you this is we set out for a pretty diverse study and quickly realized that there wasn't a diverse study out there to be had in the context of large parts of Chicago. High-rise buildings. The biggest problem with the study is that we ended up comparing rich, white, retired people in high-rise buildings with relatively rich, not quite as old families in Oak Park. And that became a big limitation on the research, but I think it's also a commentary on, what's happening in terms of urban development in American cities, at least. Average household size, 1.9 people in the apartments, 3.3 in the suburban setting. And this is interesting. You can see that the GFA per household in the suburban setting, 226 meters squared, as opposed to 147 meters squared. But when you look at that on a per person setting, the high-rise apartments were far more spacious than the suburban homes. 77 meters squared per person on average in these buildings. Let's look at the 5 or 6 areas that we looked at. And again, there's a lot of research behind this. I'm just presenting the results. So with the operational energy, as I say, this is based on real energy bills. In the high-rise buildings, that also takes into account the common areas. So we got the bills from building management, for the common areas, not just the residential apartments. And each residential building was different. Some provided gas for cooking, some provided electricity. They were all different. But here's the result. The suburban home consumed less energy per square meter than the high-rise buildings. 96%. Now, I was surprised at that. And I'll tell you why I was surprised. My house was built in 1885 and has no insulation in the walls. It has a massive surface area to volume ratio. It's losing heat through the roof, through the walls, through the floor, everywhere. And yet it's performing better per square meter than the high-rise buildings. Isn't that uncomfortable? Why is that? We don't fully know. But some things are coming to light. Number one, there is so much facilities and things in these high-rise buildings, swimming pools and libraries and common spaces and, of course, elevators and common lighting, that is largely consuming a lot of energy. And even though heat loss or heat gain is much less in the high-rise building because the surface area to volume ratio is lower, there are other factors. The ratio of window to wall is much higher. The case of the 1956 Mies van der Rohe buildings, it's still a single pane of glass. But here was the really interesting thing. When we talked to a lot of the residents, they described scenarios where they had no control over their environment, where in winter the heat was blasting and they had to open the windows to let it out because they had no control over their environment in certain situations. So that also became a big factor. Okay. That was operational energy. Embodied energy was extremely difficult to calculate. To be honest, we got the construction of all these homes, and we had this grand notion that we'd calculate the embodied energy in the materials of each home. And then we quickly realized that we needed to move to published studies to try and get an average for each home. And then we found there wasn't a lot of published studies that tell you about embodied energy in homes. In the entire world, we found 16 studies that publish a gigajoules per square meter for embodied energy in high-rise buildings. And then we took an average of this and found it was 10.1 gigajoules per square meter. In the low-rise, we found a few more, 27 studies, and that came out at 6.8. So the low-rise buildings was consuming 2/3 of the high-rise scenario in terms of energy. That wasn't a surprise. These buildings don't have to contend with the environmental and structural considerations that tall buildings do through wind and seismic and all the other things. So that wasn't a surprise. Water consumption. Again, all based on water bills. The suburban home consumes 137% of the typical apartment home on a per person per year basis. Again, that wasn't a surprise. Gardens, various other things impact water consumption in a suburban setting. Maybe the surprise is that it wasn't greater. Mobility and transport movements. This was really surprising. By the way, again, I talked about a lot of detail. We tracked transport to work, school, shopping, restaurant, entertainment, family and friends, and other. So we tracked everything. We tracked movement by walking, bicycle, automobile, bus, CTA train, metro train, other. Further, within this website, you could say, well, 2 days a week I travel to work by car. 1 day a week I walk and then get on the metro. And 2 days a week I take the bus. So there was a real sensitivity in how we track this data. And here's what we found. We found that residents on average in a downtown scenario were spending 6.6 hours per week traveling. Whereas in the suburban scenario, 7.2. That's pretty comparable. That's 109%. Now, during that time, they're traveling 40% greater distance in the suburban setting, but we expected that to be much higher. Now, when you look at how they're traveling, this was the real surprise. 65% of all transport journeys for people living in those high-rise apartments was by car, was by automobile. Actually greater than those living in the suburban scenario. Now, they weren't traveling as far, 98 kilometers, but I think the point that we were taking from this is, yes, there's a lot of, you can see in terms of walking, the average resident downtown was walking 23 kilometers as opposed to 11 kilometers in suburban. But when it came to going to the shops or recreation, or people were getting in their car, even in a dense downtown environment. That was supported by car ownership. 1.2 cars per household. There's only 1.9 people per household in the high-rise scenario. 1.2 cars. Availability of parking spaces, and I realize this would be completely different in a European and possibly an Asian context, but 1.4 car spaces per household. Pretty surprising. This is where the fun really started. Urban-suburban infrastructure. Almost an impossible subject to really try and quantify, but we gave it a good shot. We looked at just 4 things. Road networks, electricity supply, gas supply, and water supply. We quickly realized we could not calculate the energy implications of infrastructure, but we wanted to get some relative assessment. So we set a whole bunch of our students working on this study where we asked them to go out there and measure the total length of electricity cables in the whole of Oak Park. By the way, this is an environment with 52,000 people, and they happily did it. We did the same thing downtown. We calculated the entire surface area of roads in both scenarios. Similar with gas networks, similar with water. Then we looked at the populations that are existing in both those scenarios, and we brought in, I mean, this was interesting, we brought in the increase in the downtown scenario through daytime commuting. So that actually resulted in a net gain in the loop of 129,000 people per day. In the suburban scenario, it was the equivalent of minus almost 3,000 people because they're typically commuting outside the area. By the way, this was adjusted. We did it on a basis of, well, they're roughly at work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, so that's how we calculated the population. There you can see the adjusted population. We also, in the case of Oak Park, factored in the infrastructure in between and how many people were using that infrastructure in between, in the suburbs in between. So this was a really detailed study, and we found this out. The road network area was 1,200% greater in the suburban area than the urban area. This is very approximate, but the average was that there was 714% more infrastructure in the suburban scenario than the urban scenario. Quality of life. Hundreds of questions we asked them, quality of life, but it all boils down to this. These figures are out of 5. So number 1, people were generally happy in the scenarios that we studied, which is not surprising because we compared rich white people in high-rise buildings with rich white people in low-rise buildings, so that wasn't surprising. But we found that there was not a lot of variance between the two. The suburban scenario had a slightly higher sense of community index. The rich white retired people in the high-rise scenario had a slightly high satisfaction with life. Okay, almost done. I just want to summarize this for you. Those figures I've shown, we've superimposed them on the framework of the study. I already told you, the water consumption, 130, these figures, percentages here are suburban to urban ratios. So the water consumption was greater in suburban, 137%. The energy consumption was less, it was 96%. But here really is the key finding from this study. It's all about the infrastructure. Now, there are lots of limitations on this study, and I'm going to go through these. And we need to be careful how we publish and promote this study and how we use it, because it is a relatively small pilot study. And I think if we'd chosen social housing, it would be different. I think if we'd chosen non-US cities, it would be completely different. So we do need to be careful with this study. However, our findings are that, we need to start to be a little bit careful with, as architects and engineers, saying, well, I built a tall building, job done. Which is, I kind of feel, a sentiment in the industry. It's like the act of building a tall building is saving the planet. It's not necessarily the case, especially when it's an isolated tall building that's not connected into infrastructure and all those things. The real finding from this is it's not necessarily just about the tall building. It's about urban density. It's about the saving of land and the concentration of infrastructure. However, it would be very amiss of me to not point out what you all know already, which is this is just a small study and is open to some problems. What went wrong there? Oh, yeah, I'm just emphasizing the pilot study bit. So number one, the case studies were unequal. Despite our best efforts, we largely ended up comparing families in suburbia with older people, semi-retired in high-rise. There's clearly a lack of diversity amongst all the case studies. We need to redo this study with a much wider socioeconomic spread, ethnic spread, age spread. A lack of diversity in the building types. It would be great to do this study with a low, mid-rise, and high-rise in lots of different urban scenarios and different geographies. Despite the buildings being totally on board for the study, when it came to giving us a lot of the data, they weren't even sure they had it themselves, which was an issue. Despite our best intent to go back and interview everybody, we haven't really had time to do that and find out what the issues were with some of these things. And again, this is based on 250 households. But I finished that where I started, which is there are a lot of big data studies out there which miss some of the nuances, which hopefully I've shown today. What's next? This report will be coming out early next year. It'll be many, many pages long, and it'll go into detail on all the findings I've shown today. But really, the next step of this is to do the study again and do it better and do it bigger and be more inclusive in what it embraces. But to do that, we need funding. If we do get to do a phase 2 of the study, here are the things that we'd look at. We'd look to make it bigger, more participants. We'd look to bring in buildings of different height and locations, more diverse socioeconomic groups, including social housing, and across cities in an international study. But we can't do that without some help financially supporting. This needs a big team to do this. If you're interested in the project at all or getting involved in a phase 2, then please let me know. Thank you.